representing the Ministry of Finance of Brazil, the Executive Secretary, Mr. Dario Durigan. Welcome. Well, our host today, as I've mentioned, is Mr. Ilan Goldfein, President of the IDB since December 2022. He previously directed the IMF's Western Hemisphere Department in 2022 and led the Banco Central do Brasil from 2016 to 2019, being recognized as the Central Banker of the Year in 2017 and 2018. Mr. Goldfein has also held prominent roles in Brazil's private financial sector, including Chief Economist at Itaú Unibanco. Now I invite Mr. Ilan Goldfein for his opening remarks.
Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for joining us for our conversation on financial innovation, climate, development. I have the pleasure here to have my colleagues, good friends, Kristalina, Ajay, also the Minister of Finance, the Vice Minister, Mr. Dario. We of course all feel that we miss Fernando Haddad, our Minister, but we understand that he cannot join us because of our diseases that are going on, COVID, so it's still there. Let me tell you that the challenges we face with climate change, the more I see, the more I'm convinced that we need to make a real difference. We need to transform for scale and impact of our actions as a development banks, as institutions, financial institutions. We need to both tackle climate change. If we do it just for scale, it's not going to be enough. But scale is very important to tackle climate change. The calculations for Latin America basically say that we need to invest up to 1.3 trillion reais, $1.3 trillion, which means 6.5 trillion reais per year, 12% of GDP. If we sum all that we have been providing the region, World Bank, IDB, others, it sums only 3% of that. 3%, that's all. So that means that we need to scale. We need to bring the private sector with us. We need to innovate. At the beginning, the call was for development banks to improve the balance sheet, to increase the scale. The famous capital adequacy frameworks. We are doing it. We've done it. We'll continue to do it. Exchange rate exposure arrangement, credit substitution guarantees. We transfer credit, among other things. Now we want to have also SDR denominated hybrid debt issuance with the help of the IMF and other governments. Let's see if we can get it, because for every SDR allocated in our balance sheet, it means that we can lend up to 7 to 8 times more. So that's basically us doing our homework to be able to scale. And what does it mean to scale? Just to give you an example, the IDB. If we do things the way we plan it, we can get up to $112 billion, 560 billion reais in the next 10 years, more than we have now. And that means that we can triple our finance to climate from 50 million to 150 billion, from 50 billion to 150 billion dollars over the next 10 years. So that means that we can do much more. We are headed at the IDB next week to our very important annual meeting. For the first time ever, we're going to have 3 transformational changes at the same time. It never happened at ADB that we had an annual meeting as important. It's an annual meeting that will define our new institutional strategy until 2030. It's an annual meeting that will define the capitalization of the IDB Invest, or products of the hand, and it will be also the annual meetings that replenish the resources of the IDB lab. The last two are very important for private sector. Institutional strategy will be an enabler of bringing more resources. But here today we are here to talk about financial innovation. So let me tell you about a little bit what we have done at the IDB before. First, we try to help countries issue more debt that is linked to sustainable goals. Uruguay, they issue a debt sustainability linked to indicators. Huge success. At the IDB, we tried to emulate the same incentives, and we created the BID Clima, which means that our loans will have lower borrowing costs if the country reaches targets like deforestation, CO2 emissions, verifiable indicators. We have 9 pilots, and they're already starting to work. You reach your target, you get lower borrowing costs. We use the concessionality money at the right time, at the right moment. But that's not all. We left the pandemic with countries with very high debt. But it's also a period of high interest rates and high risk. So let's take this challenge as an opportunity and do debt swaps, which basically brings debt to ambitious goals together. And we have done it at ADB with the largest debt swap with Ecuador, that basically gave them $1 billion of savings. Half of it is going to Galapagos. The other half reduces borrowing costs. Huge success. So many countries are coming. Debt for nature, debt for climate, debt for health, debt for education. But this is not going to be here forever, because interest rates will not stay as high forever. We hopefully risk will go down. So this is the timing to try to get a very important Chinese debt into an opportunity, into directing the resources of the saving to what we would like to do. That's number 2. Let me now talk about what we have just signed with the Brazilian Finance Ministry, with the Brazilian Environmental Ministry, with Marina Silva, and with other partners, including the World Bank and the UK government, which is basically trying to solve an old problem that now it's more emergency. We are close to the turning point. We need to act fast. So just saying this is a problem we cannot solve, who's going to get the risk, who's going to stay there, is not enough. Let's try it. So we have partner basically offering the conditions that the IDB have when it negotiates swaps and negotiates options, transfer them to Brazil so that the cost of protection goes down. Doesn't mean there's no cost, there's no magic, we're just transferring something to lower cost, that's all. In addition, we're going to provide line of credit, which when a company needs liquidity, when it gets a high depreciation, a very large depreciation, then we can provide a 10-year loan in the case the depreciation is very high. And there's a lot of lines, this is just part of it. I was promising Dario that we need to communicate simple in tranches, so I'm not going to get to the rest of it. But this is an old problem with a new initiative. But the only thing I can tell you is that if we are managed to do it, we will be able to replicate it for other countries and other places. So just to conclude, we are now collaborating with the Brazilian government. We collaborate with the IMF in several instances. We signed an historic MOU with the World Bank. And I just want to tell you that there's tremendous interest in these financial innovation tools. There's also a lot of gains from the collaboration. We believe that together we can mobilize more private investment and do much more to tackle climate change and other challenges, both here in Brazil and elsewhere. I hope you'll work with us to do more of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goldfein, for your reflections. Our next speaker will be Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF since 2019. Prior to the IMF, she was the CEO of the World Bank and served as European Commission Vice President. She has also served on many international panels, including as co-chair of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on humanitarian financing. Now I invite Ms. Kristalina Georgieva for her opening remarks. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be in Sao Paulo, wonderful to be in Brazil. I can say, with my limited knowledge of the language, obrigado. I want to start by saying that the topic we discussed today is really difficult. The climate crisis is already upon us, and we have to admit we have been a bit slow to address it. Even today, with all the mobilization around the world, if we put all the national determined contributions together, we would cut in this decade emissions only by 11%. And we have to go somewhere between 25 and 50% to succeed. So to mobilize financing for mitigation, adaptation, and transition is a paramount priority also for our economies, because if we don't, climate shocks would affect the performance of our economies, the well-being of people and businesses, and we will be missing on the fantastic opportunity of the green transition. When we look at the numbers, they're gigantic. Just for emerging markets, just for the mitigation side of the climate fight, we would need 2 trillion a year, and some experts actually say no, 3 trillion a year, starting in the next years and going year after year after year. We don't quite yet have this money. And the question is, how do we get it? How do we get there? From the perspective of the IMF, I want to make 4 points. First, we are still wasting money on activities that are actually creating the climate problem. Last year, direct fossil fuel subsidies reached $1.3 trillion. If we take into account the indirect subsidies, the fact that we don't put the full price on carbon, that there are health impacts of fossil fuel-related pollution, if we aggregate all this, we are talking about $7 trillion. Obviously, we have to find policy ways to redirect money, being mindful how we do it, because if we do it poorly and we affect especially poor people, then what we would have is protests on the street. So this area of how we can deal with subsidies and create incentives for decarbonization is one that we at the fund take to heart. 2, we recognize that to get more public investment, it would depend on the ability of the public purse to efficiently and effectively collect taxes and deploy the money well. At the IMF, we have started together with the World Bank a big program on domestic resource mobilization that aims to address this, to improve the quality of revenues and quality of spending, but also to focus on three, on local capital markets development and the ability with local currency to take on a long-term investment in a predictable manner. And four, we all have to pitch in. For us at the IMF, that meant two things. One, creating a designated instrument to finance the climate, support countries to finance the climate transition. It is called Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We created it in a very interesting way. Do you know, Ilan mentioned it, special drawing rights. This is what we at the fund create on the strength of our members, and in 2021 we allocated 650 billion of those special drawing rights to countries that needed reserves and liquidity, and to countries that didn't need it because they had strong reserve position to begin with. So we went to these countries and said, why don't you lend us some of those dormant SDRs, and we can create a positive 40 billion strong fund to support our members struggling with the green transition. And of course, we want to see this 40 billion mobilizing private finance, multiplying, as Ilan said, he wants to do with the SDRs over there. To conclude, it is tough, but it is not impossible. How many of the audience are Brazilians? Raise your hand. So, Pelé, what did Pelé say on this topic? Pelé said, the tougher the victory, the more you enjoy it. So we are gonna win this mobilization, and we will enjoy it for the benefit of our kids and their children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Georgieva, for your insights. Our next guest for this opening section is Mr. Dario Durigan, Executive Secretary of the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Durigan holds a law degree from the University of Sao Paulo and a master's degree in law and legal research from the University of Brasilia. He served as a legal affairs advisor to the Civil House of the Presidency of the Republic. He has also served in the Attorney General's office. In the private sector, Mr. Durigan was Director of Public Policies for WhatsApp in Brazil. Mr. Durigan, I welcome you for your opening remarks, please.
Hi everyone. Oi todo mundo. Meu nome é Dario Durigan, sou secretário executivo do Ministério da Fazenda. E hoje estou tendo a honra de manhã na primeira sessão do G20. Tive a honra e agora à tarde também de representar o ministro Fernando Haddad em todo esse evento tão importante. I will switch to English. It was just a very quick greeting here in Portugal. So it's an honor for me to speak on behalf of Minister Fernando Haddad, which is this very important event sessions in the G20 presidency of Brazil. The topics that we will discuss today could not be more relevant. President Lula and also Minister Haddad have been pushing an ambitious agenda of economic reforms in the country. They include new fiscal rules. We've been talking before here in the backstage about the importance of the new fiscal landmark approved last year by the Congress that assured macroeconomic stability that we're seeing now. Also a broad tax reform, historic tax reform we approved last year in Congress, the first democratic tax reform approved in Brazil, along with other regulation, smart regulation, state-of-the-art adjustments in the legislation of Brazil, refining the litigation culture of the country, and so on. All those measures were drafted by our team, and we have been doing a great effort to gather the best experts from the public administration in Brazil, people who knows economy, who knows politics, who knows public administration. And I think we have achieved that. We have a great team at the ministry. And at the same time, we know that it's very important to have this team talking to the international experts. And this is, I think, the most centered topic of this meeting from my side. All these measures were drafted by our team, taking into consideration the best international practices provided by the staff of international institutions such as IMF, World Bank, and IDB. Creating new financial instruments and overcoming existing barriers to foreign investments are fundamental to expanding green investments in Brazil and Latin America. At the Ministry of Finance, under the leadership of Minister Fernando Haddad, we have sought to position Brazil at the center of this debate. Earlier this week, we launched the Eco Investment Brazil with a press conference along with the IDB and the World Bank. It will be an indispensable complement to our ecological transformation plan, which aims not only to decarbonize our economy, but also to enhance the technological and industrial capabilities of our productive sector. We will continue to seek to launch new financial solutions developed by our best technicians, always with the support of international institutions. So it's a great honor for me to be here alongside with Mr. Ilan, President of the IDB, and a key supporter of a bunch of measures that we are launching at the Ministry of Finance. And I will highlight here the Eco Investment Brazil, this very important program that we launched this week. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Banga, President of the World Bank, great partner of us. We've been discussing with the World Bank forest investments, and since the beginning, they have been a great partner for us in the ecological transformation plan. Finally, I would also like to thank Ms. Georgieva Kristalina for her generous words about tax reform earlier this week, and the dialogue with the IMF was crucial in shaping our key measures last year, especially the fiscal framework. This opening session represents the alignment of the Ministry of Finance with the international institutions in the joint effort to establish the foundations of a new economic policy. Mr. Haddad has been pointing out this, and I think this is a great mark of our administration in Brazil since last year. Thank you very much, and thank you, the representatives of the institutions here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Durigan. We had to make this switch in the order of the speakers because Mr. Durigan is going to open the ministerial session at the G20 Brazil. A very busy schedule today, right? So whenever you have to leave, please, Mr. Durigan, feel free. Thank you once again. Now let's continue. Let me introduce you to Mr. Ajay Banga, President of the World Bank. Mr. Banga served as Vice Chairman at General Atlantic, was President and CEO of MasterCard, and Honorary Chairman of the International Chamber of Commerce. He's also a co-founder of the Cyber Readiness Institute. Mr. Banga, I invite you now for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about three things. And the first thing is that at COP28, World Bank made two commitments that are relevant to this discussion. The first one is that by 2030, 45% of our financing will go towards climate-related financing, half towards mitigation, half towards adaptation. Why the half and the half? Because it's not that we would be unhappy if it becomes 52% versus 48. It's not the 50%. It's to show people that climate is not only about mitigation. It is equally important to do something about adaptation. And doing the right thing on adaptation is actually the right thing for development. Because what constitutes climate adaptation investment? It is schools that can weather a climate catastrophe. It is roads that can handle a climate catastrophe. It is heat-resistant varieties of seeds and drip irrigation and digital education in the event of a catastrophe so that kids don't miss out on education. Those are all adaptation. They are nothing other than development expenses. But we don't seem to understand the importance of being equally conscious about mitigation and adaptation. So the idea was to focus the World Bank attention on both things being important. The second thing we talked about was voluntary carbon markets. This comes a little bit to Kristalina's point about where will the resources come from. She spoke about subsidies and direct resource mobilization. Another one is a voluntary carbon market. Unfortunately, and Ilan mentioned them too, over the years they have not done as well as people had hoped they would do to help channel money from the developed world to the developing world, if the developing world were to do the right things in terms of aspects of green and climate that they deserve to be paid for as global public goods. Why is that? Because of the fear of greenwashing, and in some cases the feeling that people were taking the easy way out on these credits. What we are trying to do is forestry projects, which is what the Minister was referring to. Forestry projects where the World Bank is involved directly, where we can do some degree of jurisdictional audit, that trees are not being cut here to be planted there. And we can do a social audit to ensure that most of the money that comes from the sale of that carbon credit goes to the community and not just to the government. So that the incentive to cut the tree down when you turn your back is not there. That idea of both environmental integrity and social integrity of these carbon credits is what we are going to do with 15 countries in forestry. An attempt to get it going over the coming period and see if with the stamp of integrity, of environment and social integrity, can we get a price for the carbon credit that goes beyond the $6 to $7 a ton that today we are getting in the market to something closer to 15, 20, let alone the 40 and 50 that people would like to be. That's the second thing. The third thing has to do with the private sector. So Kristalina and Ilan both mentioned that you cannot do this without the private sector. So let's pick renewable energy. The private sector knows that wind and solar today, per unit of delivered cost, are cheaper over time than fossil fuel-based electricity. They know that. There may be a longer gestation period, there may be a higher capital cost in the beginning, but eventually the line goes in the correct direction. So then why is it that trillions are not rushing in to be invested in solar and wind in the countries, particularly the middle-income countries where the consumption of electricity will grow as their population and prosperity grows, and that will change the impact of all the savings you might have in the developed world on the mix of electricity and its emissions. So how do you change this? Why is it that people are not running in to invest in these countries? And basically the private sector lab is set up, and I don't know if Mark Carney is still here, but he was speaking with us a little while ago, but he helped us set this up. And essentially what we learned from 15 CEOs is 4 things that talk about the financing required to merely make the trillions come true that both Ilan and Kristalina referred to. And the first one is regulatory policy clarity. If a country is clear that they are going in a certain direction on a percentage of their revenue, of their energy mix that will come from renewables, and if they create the right policies, at least some of them clarifying tariffs, utility, liquidity and the like, you will find that the private sector gets highly reassured by the fact that there is an area here that they can understand and invest in. I give the example of India often on this. India declared in Prime Minister Modi's first term that he would aim for 30% by solar by 2030. He's currently in manufacturing capacity at 42%. There's still a few years to go. He has to connect the grids. He has to organize the right technology. He's doing some of that. But hopefully we'll get to 30 by 2030. And a large part of it came from the regulatory clarity that his government provided early in their first term. The second thing that comes up is, even if you get that, is political risk insurance. And that's where the World Bank can play a bigger role. We have an institution called NIGA, which provides political risk insurance and does about $6 to $7 billion a year for the private sector in such circumstances. We want to get to 20 by the year 2030. And in fact, we've got approval from our board to provide that same platform for IDB and other multilateral development banks as well, so that he doesn't have to reinvent that platform, but he can release his capital through these guarantees that can be written on our books. What we're doing is to combine the different places in the World Bank where these guarantees were being originated. There were almost 20 different locations in the bank, 20 different types of guarantees. We're bringing them together into 3 simple categories, putting them together under NIGA, creating a simple cafeteria-style menu of how a country can understand and a private company can understand what kind of guarantee they need. Political risk, credit guarantee, or a commercial guarantee. And that's what we're going to do. We're increasing the staff in our guarantee business outside of Washington, D.C. by 40%, so that countries and clients in these countries can reach this guarantee easily. That's the second big issue that the private sector was speaking. The third one, Ilan mentioned, foreign exchange. This is the hardest one. And while Ilan is making a big effort in Brazil with the government to start a hedging platform, he and I both know this is not easy. It requires scale, it requires risk capital, and it requires creative ways of thinking about this. Our private sector lab has a couple of suggestions for us that we are working on, including risk-sharing models, where you can take the risk between the private investor, the government, and then the multilateral banks taking the tail risk of an investment of this type. Last item, despite this all, would be the idea of originating to distribute, meaning can we create a marketplace where these assets and such things can be securitized so that pension funds and investors can find a way to understand these loans and securitize them. The problem is, if you look at our balance sheets today, all these loans are very bespoke. You cannot create a securitization market where every loan is bespoke. You need a degree of standardization and a way of originating these loans to create such a market. This is probably the longest term solution and something we're still working on. So, 3 different topics. Very important to understand that we've got these commitments, why mitigation and adaptation, to the voluntary carbon markets for forestry that we want to try and see, and finally, the work with the private sector, where I believe over the next year or 2, we should begin to see real results coming out of all this. So, Ilan, thank you for hosting us, and thank you for being my friend and partner, and thank you, Kristalina.
Thank you, Mr. Banga, for your thoughts. Thank you all for the presence. I know you also have a very busy schedule today. So a round of applause for our guests, please. So let's move on. Now we'll have our first section on financial innovation for climate investments. Humanity is facing a challenge. Climate change, once thought as a problem for the next generation, is manifesting its presence by the day. How can we address this? We need to shift climate financing from billions to trillions. Mobilization of private capital is crucial, and it will require building a conducive and enabling environment and creative financial solutions to mitigate risks and barriers for investment on a much larger scale. How can we face this life-changing challenge? Our keynote speaker today will be Mr. Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and co-chair for the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, a practitioner-led coalition working to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy. He previously served as governor of the Bank of England, governor of the Bank of Canada, and chair of the Financial Stability Board. He is a long-time and well-known advocate for sustainability, specifically with regard to the management and reduction of climate risks. Let's welcome to the stage Mr. Mark Carney.
Obrigado. Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying. And let me thank as well Dario, and by extension, Minister Haddad, for the generous hospitality here, the excellent organization of these meetings. Those individuals are all going into a very high impact meeting, I can assure you from what I've seen. And also, more fundamentally, for Brazil's ambitious agendas to accelerate its own net zero transition and to put nature at the center of not just Brazil's efforts, but the world's efforts. And this impact is already being felt, first and foremost in the step change in protection of the Amazon, but also because the drive is reinforcing the momentum. And one of my messages, there's real momentum on financial innovation coming out of COP28 in Dubai a few months ago. And the commitments at COP28, if implemented, always the key thing in climate, if implemented, will close almost a third of the gap that the world needs to do between now and 2030. That is an enormous number, and it gives a sense of what happens when you focus on the big things. So I'm going to try to walk through some of the aspects of financial innovation that potentially has those impacts. And we heard some of that from the leaders of our multilateral institutions. Big picture, we're getting to a point, there's lots of negative news, and two things can be true at the same time. We're in more and more trouble because we have less and less margin of error. But the emissions curve is beginning to bend. It is beginning to bend. But at the same time, much more will need to happen to reach climate justice, both here in Brazil and around the world. And that requires financial innovation. And one of my points is that this financial innovation, we need to think about it as a system. We need to think about it together. The whole has to be greater than the sum of the parts. Just one FX facility is incredibly important, but it needs to be linked in with blended finance and other markets. So the way I want to organize my comments is around three gaps that we need to close. Data, action plans, and investment. Investment's obviously the most important, but the first two are necessary conditions in order to achieve the third. Quickly on climate data, because this issue around disclosure has been around for a long time. It was a little more than 8 years ago, Mike Bloomberg and I launched something called the TCFD in Paris. It was a voluntary approach to climate disclosure. By Glasgow 2 years or so ago, that voluntary approach had been taken about as far as it could go. So leading companies, including financial institutions here in Brazil, were working with TCFD, but it's really time for the authorities to pick up the baton and develop a standard of equality of authority standards through something that was launched at Glasgow called the International Sustainability Standards. Now, if you know anything about the development of international standards, and this is a sophisticated audience, they developed those standards overnight. They were completed by June of last year, so within 18 months, in part because of the work that had come before, but it's still a remarkable achievement. And leading countries, led by Brazil, have now committed to make them mandatory by the middle of this decade. And I'd suggest that in that meeting, just across the way, the question for everybody who hasn't made that commitment is why haven't you? You're a G20 country, you have this standard that's been proven to work, the leading jurisdictions are doing it. Make your commitment to mandatory implementation of disclosure because we have to close that data gap. Next quick point on the data gap is disclosure is important. That those at the sharp end, if you will, of finance can use that to allocate capital. But every stakeholder should have freely available access to the key data. So disclosure by companies, what their targets are, how they're performing against targets. And those you saw on the stage, amongst others, the leaders of the OECD, plus the FSB and others, have come together to create something called the Net Zero Data Public Utility, which does basically that. All you need to know is that within a few years, we should have freely available access to see who's part of the solution, who's part of the problem. Okay, let me move to the second gap, which is around action plans, because disclosure just defines the problem. Action plans are needed to fix it. What we've done at GFANS is to encourage our members to have net zero transition plans. Already over 250 of them are in train for this year. and policymakers in some of the major jurisdictions, the EU, the US, Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, are already recommending this as a broader approach. A simple point. It took us 10 years to go from the concept of climate disclosure to mandatory. We can't wait another decade for plans to deal with the problem. So a simple message at the G20 is to get this into the heart of their recommendations for companies and financial institutions. And very importantly, as part and parcel of this, is to ensure that those transition plans, and what's defined as transition finance is, of course, it is green finance. It's wind and solar, hydro, power, battery storage, but it also has to be going where the emissions are, going to those heavy emitting sectors and providing finance to get those emissions down. So not everybody in those heavy emitting sectors has plans or capability to do that, but you have to take on emissions in order to do that, or we will not get to net zero consistent with 1.5 degrees. Now, the only way we're going to get to where we need to go with those two building blocks, disclosure and action plans, is through investment. And so I want to spend the balance of my remarks just going through elements of that investment and how finance and some necessary financial innovation fits into it. The first and the bedrock of this is a continued acceleration in clean energy investment. And if you're looking for aspects of glass half full, part of the story is with respect to clean energy investment. Global clean energy investment has grown 40% since 2020 to 1.8 trillion. That is almost twice as much as the annual investment rate in conventional oil and gas. So it went from half as much to almost twice as much. That's the good news. The challenge is that growth curve needs to continue at the same rate. It's the fastest rate of growth in energy in history. It needs to continue at that rate. Now, a key outcome of COP28, one of the commitments that needs to be fulfilled, is that countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, carefully crafted language, but more tangibly to triple renewable capacity, clean energy capacity globally by 2030. Now that's basically tomorrow if you know about investment in this area. So action needs to be happening right now, and that tripling of energy capacity comes alongside with the commitment to double energy efficiency. But as I said a moment ago, it won't be enough to just do clean energy. We also need to go where the emissions are, which is in the heavy emitting sectors. So steel, aluminium, chemicals, cement, heavy duty transport, including marine and airlines. And this is hard. These are tough sectors to electrify. We need to build whole new facilities, manufacturing facilities. They're new fuels that are not economic yet and are potentially economic at large scale. There are often regulatory barriers that skew incentives. And it's very much a case of things being interconnected across energy sources and downstream. So if there's slow progress, let's say in hydrogen, it's going to slow progress in steel. And if steel doesn't demand hydrogen, it has the same impact. So there's a massive coordination issue. The consequence of that is that if you're in these sectors, your investors want their money back today. So they're in transition traps. They can't invest their cash flows in the necessary technologies, and we need to help break that. And part of what came out of COP28 is something called the Industrial Transition Accelerator. What you need to know about that is, first, that its goal is to get all of the leaders around the table in these sectors, in the energy sector, that are providing solutions. The main standard setters in the various industries, so think the International Maritime Organization for shipping, for example, the key governments, of which Brazil obviously should be one, and crucially finance there at scale in real time so that this coordination problem is solved. And the way we're approaching this is to be brutally practical about it. With 1,300 companies, they alone are responsible for 17% of global emissions themselves. They're part of organizations that are part of this. We're setting a goal of COP30, so when we're here in less than 2 years' time, for investment decisions for large-scale decarbonization to focus the mind and unlock this. And crucially, I spoke about action plans a moment ago. What we're looking for is to build on plans such as we see in Brazil with Nova Industria, the ecological transformation plan, where countries have set out their priorities and their focus, and now the action is to go in with partners, not just private sector, but with partners at the IDB, the World Bank, etc., and put together financing packages to turn plans into reality. And that leads me to, and I'm still 4 minutes, so good, leads me to my next point, which won't surprise you, that really to truly have a transition, it must be global, and in order to have a global transition, we need, and Avinash Corso is here in the front row, has helped lead this, we need a radical change in the international financial architecture. To the credit of the Brazilian presidency, that is front and center, because the reality is that we have collectively been caught what I would call a sort of paradox of prudence. So you have individual institutions that are being micro-prudentially careful. They're not lending to riskier new projects such as I just discussed in these heavy emitting sectors, but collectively it means capital is not getting there to solve the problem, and it's leading to this, it's contributing to this climate catastrophe. And in the end, nobody's AAA if there's no plan. That's the bottom line. And so to break that, again, it's a coordination game that's starting to be broken. Now, some of the solutions you've just heard. The IDB's, full credit to the IDB on this innovative, and the Brazilian government and authorities on the FX facility. Super important. Let's hope that it can be replicated and scaled elsewhere, and as I say, combined with other instruments. The Resilience and Sustainability Trust of the IMF. And what Ajay just spoke to, he outlined an entire agenda, but he's delivering on that agenda today with a unified guarantee package out of the World Bank. The #1 ask of private sector providers of capital to accelerate transition in the emerging and developing world, and it's a real prospect to scale significantly capital. We've also seen, we saw at COP28, through the hosts, the Emiratis set up a new vehicle called Altera, $30 billion, a lot of money, their money, on the table for the transition, but designed in a way that should, and I think very much will, catalyze $250 billion for the transition. Included in that is a very innovative structure where there's a capping of the return to Altera for the transition in emerging and developing economies. And that allows much more capital to crowd in. So it's a challenge. It's a good in and of itself, but I also think of it as a challenge to others to do more. So I welcome Brazil's focus on this. And I'm going to finish by talking about nature. And like others, I'm going to start on carbon credits, which of course is a part of the broader story. It is, I would say it's beyond time, but it's time for the G20 to grasp the nettle on setting the standards for end-to-end integrity in voluntary carbon markets. This discussion has been going on for well over a decade. The world's been burning while it's been happening. And this is really an opportunity for hundreds of billions of dollars annually in capital to go from the developed economies through basically companies and financial institutions to projects in the emerging and developing world, ancillary benefits for biodiversity and direct benefits, if done right, for indigenous peoples. For that, we need supply integrity. A lot of work's been done. I'm going to give you an acronym, ICVCM. Demand integrity, in other words, who can buy these credits? You have to be working hard to get your emissions down to buy these credits, but VCMI and others have worked on that. Market integrity, bunch of plumbing stuff important to people like me and former central bankers. Just rest assured, someone better make sure that's there. And crucially, social integrity, and Ajay spoke to this, and it's really a role that only the international, the multilateral development banks and others can play. The private sector cannot play, cannot fight for social integrity. And this leaves me with the final point about really the next frontier of financial innovation is around this intersection between nature and climate. Climate has become the dominant destroyer of nature. 70% of wildlife population has gone in my lifetime, 40% of our natural capital since the early 1990s. And conversely, nature-based solutions can be the cheapest form of emissions reductions if we get this right. And so through the ecological transformation plan and its G20 leadership, Brazil can help bring nature to the heart of these solutions. So I'll conclude, like Kristalina, I will appeal to the rich literary heritage here, and the writer and indigenous leader, Alison Krenak, who defines, amongst other things, spirituality as the interdependence between all living things. And it's a reminder for us that everything is connected. As I've tried to stress in climate finance, it's all connected. We need to build these instruments and then bring them together. We can't manage what we don't measure, so we need disclosure. There's no point having disclosure unless we have plans to act on it. Those plans have to allow, and the financial system has to get capital to heavy emitting industries and the emerging economies. And finally, we need innovation in finance that recognizes that we're part of nature, not separate or a part of it. That natural value, or the nature of value, must recognize the value of nature for indigenous peoples, for local communities, and for all who live on this planet today and tomorrow. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Mark Carney, for your insightful remarks. Now, I invite to the stage our moderator, Mr. Avinash Persaud, Special Advisor on Climate Change at the IDB, and our distinguished panelists, Mr. Rogério Seron, the Treasury Secretary of Brazil, and Sir Alok Sharma, Member of Parliament of the United Kingdom and former President of COP26. A round of applause for them, please. Thank you for the presence. Avinash, the floor is yours, please.
Obrigado, Ajay. Let me just give a context to this panel for the next 2 minutes or so. The Glasgow COP, led by Sir Alok, played a critical role in changing climate negotiations. It brought forward the scale, the pace, the money we needed for the green transformation. And it emphasized that this bill was too big for governments alone. NDBs needed to play a bigger role. SDRs too, and the private investors. And many at Glasgow rallied to Mark's call for arms at that COP. I see some people in the audience, Amar Bhattacharya, who was a leader of one of the expert groups set up, commissioned at COP26, who also pointed out, their reports pointed out, that if we're going to protect the planet, then we need to accelerate the green transformation in large emerging market economies. And this would require more money, this would require an acceleration that went beyond what would happen naturally and domestically, a real acceleration. But it would require a tremendous amount of capital inflows. The estimates are over $1 trillion per year. And whilst private capital flows are increasingly financing the green transformation in developed countries, those flows are not going south. That's partly because of what we might call micro risks, project risks, regulatory risks. But it can't just be that, because if we look around us, we're not seeing large southward flows even when there are no major micro risks. And that's because there are large amounts of perceived macro risks, country risks, credit risks, policy risks. And these combine with a risk aversion to mean that the cost of hedging foreign exchange is prohibitive for many investors. In the case of Brazil, it's often been over 10 percentage points. And that would mean that the return, the dollar currency return of a project in Brazil will go so low as you pay that cost of hedging that it takes that tide of capital we need and turns it into a trickle. And so we got reducing foreign exchange hedging costs as a part of the G20 and COP agendas last year. And over the last several weeks, teams by the Treasury Secretary Saron in Brazil, Ministry of Finance, and at the IDB have been working very hard on developing a new foreign exchange platform, where projects in Brazil can offer dollar returns and dollars to suppliers without huge hedging costs. Now, the way it works, the way it would work best, is by taking the risks that we need to hedge and putting them where they are better managed and held over time. Not transferring them somewhere that can't really manage them and therefore pile on risk premiums to give them the cushion against those risks. So, for example, projects should take project risks. Projects could also take with their pricing formulas ordinary inflation risks. Governments, the government of Brazil with its fiscal rules and inflation target can smooth macro risks faced by projects over time by offering to lend dollars whenever an exchange rate were to go way below what the policy framework is, which is consistent with the policy framework of fiscal rules and inflation target. And then a AAA rated lender, like the IDB, can smooth the volatility of international capital markets, which often have an impact on local currency which has nothing to do with what's happening domestically. And so project risks being held by the project. Governments helping to smooth out macro risks that those projects face. And the IDB, a AAA rated lender, smoothing out the volatility of international capital markets that the government faces. And that allows projects to offer dollar returns and dollar to their suppliers without huge hedging costs. And to me and to you, I'm sure, it's no surprise that this Brazilian government, that this Ministry of Finance, that this Secretary of the Treasury, working with this IDB, have been working hard on developing this product. And so I'd like to ask the Secretary of the Treasury to tell us a little bit, share with us some of his own thoughts, personal thoughts and motivations and reflections on this new innovative product.
Bom, obrigado, boa tarde a todos. Acho que é consenso que todas as falas, né, as mudanças climáticas impõem um padrão de aceleração de investimento rumo à transição para a economia de baixo carbono. Isso é consenso. É consenso também, como foi dito, que a necessidade de capital ela perpassa a capacidade dos governos, em especial em países emergentes, do setor público lidar com esse desafio de investimentos. E pensando nesse contexto, né, e o papel que os países emergentes possuem no processo de redução de emissões, e em especial o Brasil, que não só tem um papel a cumprir, como tem uma grande oportunidade estratégica, né, por conta da sua matriz de energia limpa e do potencial de geração futura, que nós pensamos em um novo programa em conjunto com o BID, de criar uma plataforma de soluções que pudesse lidar com a questão da volatilidade cambial, do risco cambial. Como foi bem mencionado, a estabilidade macroeconômica desempenha um papel fundamental na redução do risco, tanto da volatilidade quanto do risco de valorização futura das moedas, a diferencial da taxa de juros só vai se resolver com a estabilização macroeconômica. Isso vale para qualquer economia emergente, vale para o Brasil. Nós estamos, como foi bem mencionado também, adotando medidas, um novo marco fiscal, reforma tributária, aprimoramentos na política monetária, todos eles no sentido de trazer mais previsibilidade, estabilidade macroeconômica para o país. Tudo isso está sendo endereçado. Mas, em paralelo, há a necessidade da atração e do aumento dos investimentos imediato. E para que isso ocorra, de fato, nós construímos e temos aí o orgulho de ter lançado nessa semana, uma semana emblemática para o Brasil, lançamos uma plataforma, o Eco-Invest Brasil, que reúne um conjunto de medidas voltadas a facilitar a integração das companhias brasileiras e dos projetos aqui no Brasil, acessarem o sistema financeiro internacional, captarem recursos em moeda forte, com segurança, assim como também criar condições para reduzir o risco dos investidores externos do país. Então, essas medidas envolvem por um lado, uma linha de blended finance, que vai apoiar as companhias brasileiras a realizar operações de dívida em dólar protegidas, com hedge cambial. Essa linha de blended finance, ela visa tornar o custo competitivo viável para essas companhias, fazer essa captação, integrar, trazer poupança externa para o Brasil, mas ao mesmo tempo também fazê-lo sem uma exposição cambial excessiva. Isso é uma parte importante da medida e vai ajudar muito a viabilizar projetos no Brasil, acessar funding externo para essa agenda. Uma outra linha vai apoiar que as instituições financeiras locais possam desenvolver produtos financeiros voltados ao hedge cambial, para resolver problemas específicos ou para ficarem mais confortáveis e tornar os produtos viáveis, para aumentar a oferta de produtos derivativos, de produtos de hedge cambial no Brasil, que há uma dificuldade muito grande no mercado acima de 1, 2 anos, não há um mercado com liquidez ou com oferta abundante em horizontes acima de 5 anos, e uma parte desses problemas podem ser resolvidos, podem ser atenuados com essa linha, seja para reduzir o risco de crédito das instituições, seja para evitar chamadas de margens que muitas vezes afastam ou dificultam projetos que estão em fase pré-operacional principalmente. Tem uma outra linha muito importante, que é uma linha de liquidez. Ela especialmente é importante para projetos de infraestrutura ou projetos que tenham uma correlação, ainda que parcial, com o câmbio, e projetos de infraestrutura em geral, eles têm uma correlação a médio e longo prazo com o câmbio, e os eventos de estresse cambial eles podem ser resolvidos por essa linha de liquidez. Isso não só vai dar segurança ao projeto, garantir que ele não vai ter um problema de fluxo de caixa, especialmente na fase pré-operacional, mas também o fato dessa linha estar disponível, nós vamos oferecer aos nossos projetos estratégicos na agenda da transição, elas vão poder ajudar em alguma medida a reduzir o risco e, obviamente, o custo do crédito das operações de dívida para esses projetos, tendo essa garantia de que haverá a manutenção do desembolso em moeda forte. Então, é uma medida também muito importante que resolve um problema específico, assim como as outras duas resolvem problemas específicos. Uma quarta linha que também compõe esse leque de recursos financeiros para apoiar a atração de investimento é uma linha para a estruturação de projetos com uma carência maior para que ela fique adequada a toda a fase de estudo, desenvolvimento do projeto e a fase pré-operacional do projeto. É uma linha que vai ter uma carência de 7 a 10 anos para o seu retorno. Então, isso facilita muito, isso ajuda muito. Ela vai ser usada especialmente para projetos que tenham uma relação com a pauta exportadora na economia do baixo carbono, isso é importante. Então, nós vamos abrindo ali um conjunto de soluções que completam o ciclo todo e podem fazer toda a diferença na atração de investimento. De forma complementar a essas ações que são feitas pelo Tesouro Nacional, há a parceria com o BID para aquisição de instrumentos derivativos no mercado internacional e repassá-los ao Banco Central para distribuir o mercado. Isso é uma medida importante também, vai ajudar a aumentar a oferta. Então, e além, para fechar esse conjunto de ações que, a nosso ver, vai ajudar a aumentar a oferta de instrumentos de proteção cambial, vai aumentar a demanda por esses instrumentos, vai atrair mais investimentos, seja por parte das companhias captando recursos lá fora, no exterior, trazendo para o Brasil, seja atraindo investidores, o FDI vindo para o Brasil de fato, nós temos também uma parceria com o BID para que toda a governança do programa seja feita de uma rede de parcerias, incluindo aí apoio de terceiros para acompanhar o programa, avaliar o programa e sugerir medidas de aprimoramento. Então, com tudo isso, nós estamos num momento muito feliz desse lançamento, contente por chegar nesse passo. Nós acreditamos que o Brasil, primeiro, vai conseguir com isso atrair mais recursos para projetos na área ambiental, na transição ecológica, é muito importante. Mas mais do que isso, esse programa, uma vez bem sucedido, nós acreditamos que ele será, ele vai ser um case que pode ser replicado para outros países, outras economias emergentes também, que vão poder se utilizar dessas soluções. E é importante que seja um conjunto de soluções, acho que uma solução mágica é um conjunto de medidas que podem ser tomadas para mitigar problemas específicos. Então, diferentes projetos vão ter diferentes dores e é importante que nós tenhamos aí instrumentos para lidar com cada um deles. Com tudo isso, nós estamos aqui nessa semana muito otimistas que nós conseguimos dar um passo importante para tornar o país, para tornar o Brasil mais atrativo para o investimento privado. E nós vamos conseguir isso mobilizando o investimento privado doméstico e mobilizando o investimento privado internacional. Então, fico muito feliz aqui a poder apresentar um pouco dos detalhes dessas medidas que foram tomadas essa semana. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much indeed. And let's also thank the very hard-working team that you have and the IDB has been working very hard on this. I see Mario in the audience, and also Anderson, and Rafael, Orlando, and Eduardo, and Morgan, very important people as part of this effort. Alok, if I can turn to you now. So 3 years or so after that most critical turning point, what are, in your mind, the key sort of remaining problems we need to solve? And in terms of the emerging solutions you've seen, what are your thoughts on those?
Great. Thank you for that, Abby. So, look, friends, if I may just take a bit more of a helicopter vision on this. So, you know, what kind of world are we facing right now? We've got huge headwinds that collectively are challenging us. You've got conflict around the world, and obviously since COP26, I'm afraid the geopolitical landscape has got a lot worse. Secondly, you still have the long shadow of COVID. Now, whilst countries have effectively come out of COVID, that has had a huge impact on balance sheets around the world. And the third is the issue of the worsening climate. I mean, you have countries, some of the most climate vulnerable countries that can least afford it across the world, that are having to spend 15% plus a year of GDP on dealing with climate vulnerabilities. That is, and by the way, that is going to get worse, because you know last year was the hottest year on record. We breached temporarily, I hope, the 1.5 degree target that was given in Paris. So we are facing some huge, huge challenges. Are countries responding? Yes, they are responding. We've seen at the various COPs, at COP26, 27, 28, there's been sort of progress being made going forward, and countries are setting out their plans for how do they deal with the climate challenge, their nationally determined contributions. And of course, going into COP30, you will see a revision of those NDCs from countries. But what you also know is that those NDCs are put together by countries on the basis of getting support, financial support. Some of it they can do with their own money, some of it they need financial support. And the big missing ingredient here, which is what we are all discussing, is finance. And it's not that the money is missing. I mean, you've heard from Mark Carney, we've launched GFANS. I was at the launch of the Brazilian chapter yesterday with Mark. There's $150 trillion of assets on the balance sheets of the GFANS members. That's great. But why is it not getting through? Right? Where is the flow? And I think that is the problem that we face right now. Now, we had Kristalina and Ajay here earlier, both, in my view, sort of brilliant leaders. But it is the case that those multilateral organizations were set up to deal with the challenges of the 20th century. But they were not set up to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. Now, it is changing, and you've heard from Ajay the changes that are being made, 45% of funding going to climate by 2030. For me, it was great to work with Kristalina when she was pushing forward on more SDRs coming forward. So that's all great. But one of the big challenges, I think, for this COP, for this G20, is to make sure we really push forward on MDB reform, and that actually does result in more money coming through. The second thing is the balance sheets and the fact that interest costs in the global south are way higher than in the north. And we have to deal with debt sustainability as well. And the final thing is that how do you get more public, but on the back of that, private finance flowing? Now, I was very pleased to hear, Ajay was talking about the work going on in this private sector lab, and that's right. What we then need to see is those solutions actually coming through. So then, coming down to some of the areas there that we could already make progress before we have sort of big reform. One, of course, is the work that you've done brilliantly on FX. I mean, I think you really need to be congratulated for that. And I think that sets the benchmark for where this can be done in other jurisdictions as well. But the second is all the work that's been going on SDRs, rechanneling. And Avi, I mean, you will all know that Avi was advisor to Prime Minister Mia Mottley doing the British Plan agenda. That was something that the Rockefeller team worked with very closely as well. So thank you for all of that. But the work coming out of that in terms of rechanneling is so important. I mean, if we could actually get rechanneling of SDRs and get governments actually committed to doing that through the IDB, through the African Development Bank, you would actually have a leverage effect, 1 to 4, 1 to 5 times. Why is that not happening? You did manage to get the debt resilience sustainability clause through, so that's great. And then I think that we've had this G20 review, this capital adequacy review, independent panel that has done this. Now, I mean, there are some reports out there that say that if you could just implement those reforms, I mean, never mind anything else, implement those reforms now, that is going to release almost another $200 billion of finance that could be used. So, as well as the work that is going on through the G20 in terms of those big reform pieces on the MDBs, we actually also need to make sure that what is possible is being done right now. And so the final point I want to make is about the opportunity for Brazil, for your country, sir. And this is really, in my view, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, this is a moment in history, because we have to cut emissions by over 40% over the next 6 years if you want to keep alive limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. You have the leadership of the G20, you have the leadership of COP30, and making sure that particularly on the finance piece, you have that green thread running through the through G20, COP30, but then also in conversations with the G7 and other sort of big events that take place over the next couple of years, to have those forcing mechanisms to get governments to do a lot more. From everything I've seen and heard over the last few days, I know that the Brazilian government is up to the task, and we're all there to help you. But this is a crucial moment, and I think this is a moment in history for Brazil.
Thank you very much, Alex. Let me try and reach some kind of conclusion to our panel. I think as human beings, we're not short of clever ideas. What we have to do is implement and accelerate. And I think we're seeing an emerging system. I think was talked a little bit about that emerging system of finance coming through in today's panel. Innovative ways in which we can try and bring the private sector, especially around mitigation, dealing with some of the major risks they deal with, whether that is volatility risks or liquidity risks, or credit risks that you talked about. And it's about using new innovative tools, as Alok was referring to, like SDRs, like debt clauses, like the capital of MDBs and expanding that capital in order to make countries more resilient. And I think we can see an emerging climate finance system. We need to accelerate it, we need to implement it, we need to learn and redouble our efforts. Please thank my two guests for their leadership, both today but also in the past. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Avinash, Secretary Seron, and Sir Alok Sharma for sharing with us such deep and meaningful words with us today. Now I want to introduce the second panel, and for that I invite Mr. Anderson Caputo Silva, Connectivity, Market and Finance Division Chief at the IDB, Mr. Winston Fritsch from PUC-Rio and the Climate Policy Initiative, His Excellency Ambassador Mahid Al-Suwaidi, Director General of COP28, Mr. Rodrigo Valdez, Western Hemisphere Department Director of the IMF, and Ms. Natalia Diaz, Director of the NDES, and also Mr. André Aquino from the Ministry of Environment and Climate of Brazil. So, welcome to all of you. A round of applause for our guests, our speakers, please. Anderson, as soon as everybody's ready, the word is yours, please.
Thanks, Adriana. Welcome, distinguished panelists. Today, as we have been discussing here, we're standing united in recognizing the importance of attracting both public and private investors to meet our ambitious climate and biodiversity goals. Building an institutional ecosystem, what we're going to be discussing here, that will support our collective aspirations for a sustainable future will require action and close collaborations from several actors, from the international finance community. It requires also think tanks, governments, communities, and the private sector. We are very fortunate to have in this panel a great combination here of views that will give us different perspectives on this challenge. I want to start then the first question and direct the question of the panel to Ambassador Al-Suwaidi. Ambassador, can you tell us about your perspective from your experience as director of COP28? What are the key bottlenecks and risks hindering international capital from flowing to fund sustainable investments in emerging markets? So how do we envision the role of the international community in leveling this playing field for increasing climate finance internationally?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's wonderful to be in Sao Paulo in this beautiful country. And of course, I'm very excited for COP30 to be here. As all of you probably know, one of the outcomes of COP28 was that we had this troika that would be working between the UAE, the Azerbaijan, and Brazilian presidency, and we already had an announcement about that a week ago. And so we're excited that we're going to be working with our Brazilian colleagues to tackle these very issues. As you know, COP28 was a great success because we were able to bring together the private sector, civil society, and the negotiators to come with really solid outcomes. And why was it so important? Because we had the global stock take, and we needed to deliver action to get us back on track to 1.5 degrees. And that didn't come easy. We did a listening tour where we traveled around the world, and we came to places like Brazil and spoke with different investors, different people in indigenous people, civil society. We spoke to everybody. And when we did that travel around the world, we learned a few things, but the main thing we learned was that finance is neither available, affordable, or accessible in many cases. And that one of the key things that we needed to do was to solve for this challenge. And we know that many of those challenges come from, and what we heard from previous speakers in the previous panel, the need to reform the international financial institutions. We need to see significant reform happening there. We need to have a better framework for how we're discussing climate finance, and that was one of the key outcomes that I would really encourage you all to look at that came out of COP28 was our finance framework that I think a lot of people underestimate how powerful this is, because it brings together the different negotiating tracks when it comes to finance, from Bridgetown, from what was happening in Paris, what's happening at the G20, what's happening in the World Bank, IMF discussions, under one discussion. And then what we need in addition to that is more capital. We are just not seeing capital getting to particularly the global south, particularly the developing world. And that is because a whole list of issues that are often around regulatory environments, currency risk, all sorts of different types of issues that are preventing capital from getting. And so our final contribution to try and help that was the creation of this 30 billion fund called Altera that was announced by our president. This fund, we hope, can raise 250 billion by 2030. And because of its scope that it can invest globally, but is focused on the global south, has the scale of trying to raise 250 billion. And then this unique structure of having a 25 billion acceleration fund that can really push finances around the world, but particularly to the global south. And a 5 billion fund that is more catalytic, it can take on more risk. We hope that we can really show a model that investing in countries like Brazil makes economic sense, and investing in climate makes even better economic sense. And so through those types of models, we can really crowd in the private sector, because fundamentally that's what we need. We need the private sector to come in a big way to deliver the capital that we're going to need. The estimates of 6 trillion, 7 trillion of capital that we need to achieve our 1.5-degree goals, and that's what we have to stick with.
Thank you so much. I